well, let's get started. I don't know how many of you work with economists, but the economists they do pretty serious work. Okay, they actually use equations. One of the things that we like about the economists is that they do believe in mathematics, and one of the things that they do is they develop these mathematical models to make predictions, obviously predictions about the future. And these models have to be established or developed based on some assumptions, okay? And one of the challenges that we in the energy community have is trying to make predictions on how we are going to use energy in the future. And this is very important because people who make decisions at the national level, whether they are politicians, planners, they have to rely on people like us, like you, who have some knowledge about science and technology to make decisions. Are we going to build a nuclear power plant? Are we going to install photovoltaic panels? Are we going to make investments in research in certain areas? Okay? And those questions can only be answered if we have a solid model that will allow us to make predictions about the future. Okay? Now, if I ask you about how we're going to use energy in the future, there are a few factors that come into the picture. The first one is energy prices. And if the price of gasoline goes up, I bet many of you are going to start using public transportation more frequently, okay? If the price of energy goes down, many of you may consider buying a car and start driving, okay? And we see this back and forth. Energy prices really dictate a lot on how we're going to utilize energy in the future. Same thing with weather patterns, and we are seeing this more and more frequently. And obviously, the prediction is that we're going to see these wild changes in climatic change, and that's going to affect how we're going to use energy in the future. And there's a very strong correlation between the economy and energy utilization. So this is a chart that shows the price of oil, okay? And this is a price of oil, but this is normalized in 2010 US dollars per barrel. And what you can see here in gray are areas where we have recessions. These are where we had economic recessions. The most recent one was in 2008, okay? And this was actually one of the worst recessions that we had since 1929 in the US. What happened is that in the summer of 2008, the price of oil almost reached $140 a barrel of oil, okay? And this was actually devastating. But what I want to show you with this chart is that there is a very strong correlation between economic activity and energy prices. And the energy prices go up, you're going to put pressure, and it can be devastating. I mean, if the energy prices reach values comparable to what we saw in 2008, you can really kill the economy. And this is where the big geopolitical discussions come into the picture. We are seeing it right now. You know, the price of oil dropped to almost $50 a barrel in the last 6 months. And the question is Saudi Arabia going to start increasing production? Well, apparently they have not. You know, typically they will use to do that to maintain the price of oil, but they decided not to do it. And this is as a result of new technologies that were implemented in the US. There's something called fracking, hydraulic fracturing. It's a technology that has allowed the US to obtain oil and gas at fairly low cost, using actually ceramic technology. I don't know if you know this, they mix ceramic particles with fluid that go into the rock, and those ceramic particles can maintain the cracks in the rock open, and that's what allows the gas and the oil to flow. So because of that, the price of oil has gone down. There's a big debate whether OPEC, can play a role in some countries, in particular Saudi Arabia. They made a decision not to increase production so that they can keep a share of the market. So again, a very strong correlation between energy prices and economic activity. So that's something that's going to dictate how much and how we're going to use energy in the future. The other three factors that are going to play important roles are economic growth, okay? And I'm going to show you that there is a very strong correlation between economic growth and energy utilization. The other one, and this is important for everybody in the world, is public policies. You know, we actually depend on what the politicians are going to decide. Do they put research dollars on the table? Do they make decisions as to put a tax on carbon, for example? And the tax of carbon can have significant implications when it comes to technology. There are public policies that could ban the use of nuclear energy, for example. And all of those public policies are going to play a role on how we utilize energy in the future. And the one that is closest to our heart is scientific and technological developments, okay? If you find a technology that produces electricity at little or no cost without environmental impact, that's really going to change the game, okay? So this plays an important role, and this is why we do research, okay? This is why we do research. We are always looking for better technologies that will be more economical, that will not affect the environment. So this is really what drives the type of work that we do in the future. So what I'm going to show you this morning is well known, okay? What I have done is I have collected a lot of information from lots of different sources, and I have put it together, and I'm going to share that with you this morning. But you can do, and I encourage you to go and review publications. For example, this is from ExxonMobil. Actually, the oil companies have prepared the best reports when it comes to future predictions when it comes to energy, because it's in their best interest to do that. So this is a report from ExxonMobil, the largest oil company in the world, and they have a report entitled "The Outlook for Energy," and this is a view to 2040. So they make some predictions, what they think is going to happen in the next 30 years, for example, and how energy is going to be utilized. BP has done exactly the same. They have a report, and they make predictions up to 2035. They just issued this report a few weeks ago. And again, these are very good analysis. And here's where the economists really come into the picture. They make lots of assumptions. They look at trends, and then they make predictions. Shell has done one for 2050. This is a recent report. It's actually very good. And I'm going to share with you some information from the Shell report. It's one of the better ones. And then in the US, the Department of Energy has a program office called the Basic Energy Sciences Office. And this office has issued around 35 different reports. And these reports outline the type of research that we should be doing to address the future energy of technology and science. And I encourage you, these are free. This can be accessed on the Department of Energy website. These are very good. These are, from the scientific perspective, the type of research that we should be doing. And this is really what drives the research projects at the US National Labs. I encourage you to review these, especially if you are writing your thesis. You want to write an introduction and put things in perspective. These are very good documents to justify the type of work that we are doing. So when you talk to the economists, the first thing that they put into their models is people, okay? Because at the end of the day, it's people what drives energy utilization. And this is a chart that shows world population in billions. And by the way, in the US, 1 billion is 1,000 millions. I think in Europe, a billion is a million. So this is 1,000 million. So right now, population is around 7-point-something billion. And here is where we are. This is time from 1820 up to the end of this century. And if you look at the models, the economists have a broad range of models. In one case, they predict that population will continue growing, and it will actually reach 14 billion by the end of the century, okay? If you look at the slope of this curve, it's actually decreasing. So if you extrapolate, it's expected that somewhere in the middle of next century, population is going to reach a peak. And then when you look at most models, actually, they predict a decrease in population as a function of time. In the middle, you have the average of these models where population will continue to grow, and it will actually reach a peak at around 2060, 2070, and then population is going to start decreasing. And if you look at the trends in Europe, almost every country in Europe has reached peak, and it's actually going down in population. The only two exceptions in Europe are Great Britain and France. And this is the result of immigration policies. If you look at the Far East, Japan has already peaked and is going down. China continues to grow, but the prediction is that China is going to peak fairly soon. And this is the result of the one-child policy in China. Okay, it's going to peak and it's going to start actually decreasing. India will continue growing. The US is going to continue growing for the next 100 years. And this is, again, the result of immigration policies in the US. There's a lot of people from Latin America and from Asia reaching the US. And that's one of the few countries that will continue growing in population as a function of time. So this is probably the most credible of all models. Population will grow, will reach a peak, and then it's going to start decreasing. And then the economists look at cataclysmic effects. You know, what happens if there is an avian flu or if there is a pandemic? And I don't know how many of you saw this movie. Have you seen this movie? Recommended. This is interesting because it will make you think about these type of scenarios. But the economists actually look at these type of scenarios, and they said, you know, what happens if we have 600 people dying because of a pandemic? And this is when you have like things like Ebola, H1N1, or those type of scenarios. You know, people get really nervous, especially because if it spreads, you know, you can get into a plane and then you cross continents, and then pretty soon you're out of control. Something like this will really affect. So when you look at these models, some of these assume that something bad is going to happen. And then you are going to decimate population, and then population in the planet is going to start to decrease. But this is the most likely scenario. This is the most likely scenario. The other thing that economists take into account is life expectancy. So we have here 4 data sets. There is one for 1900, which is this one. And what you have here on the horizontal axis is income per capita. This is the GDP normalized per person. And this is in 1991 dollars. And around the start of that, the 20th century, income was about $5,000 per person. And then life expectancy was 53, 54 years. Okay? Back in 1930, life expectancy increased. You can see that income has also increased. By 1960, life expectancy has reached almost 70 years. And then income has reached around $12,000 per person. And then in 1990, life expectancy is approaching 80 years. GDP per capita is more than $20,000. So mathematically, what we see is a very strong correlation between income and life expectancy. And the way we interpret that is that the more money you make, you can eat better, you have access to medicines, you have access to doctors, and then you're going to be able to live longer. And many countries are reaching 80 years on life expectancy. So this is something that the economists take into account into their models. The other thing that the economists take into account is how much money people are making. So this is a chart that shows population in extreme poverty, okay? And these are people who live in less than $10 a month. Here is in billions, thousands of millions, okay? This is as a function of time from 1820 up to the middle of this century. And then here on the right, we have the GDP per capita based on $1990. So what we see here first for poverty is that poverty actually increased as a function of time and reached a peak at about 1980. And from 1980 down, poverty has actually decreased. And it is projected that poverty will continue decreasing at a very rapid rate. Do you know what happened here in 1980 that explains why poverty has gone down so fast? China, okay? There was a premier in China, Deng Xiaoping, and this fellow in the 1970s, late 60s, 1970s, developed the economic model that has resulted in what China is today. And this significant decrease in poverty is the migration of people from the countryside to the cities in China to work in all the factories. So China has really become the factory of the world. And this prediction that poverty will continue decreasing is the incorporation of more peasants from China into the countryside. And we are talking about hundreds of millions of people, okay? So here you have around 1.4 billion people living in poverty, and it's expected that will continue decreasing as function of time. So if poverty goes down, GDP per capita is expected to increase. There are here 2 projections. A low projection, assuming that people will grow, economies will grow at about 1%, 1.5% a year. Here you have a very optimistic high projection where the economy will continue growing at the rate at which China has been growing in the past few years, which is more than 5%. This is very unrealistic, and we saw that in the last 2 years when the economy has actually slowed down in China. So you can believe that somewhere in between, we're going to see a GDP per capita increasing as a function of time. Okay. So this is good news. Okay, this is good news. Poverty is expected to decrease in the future. The question is, what does that mean? So let me show you. There's an organization in Denmark called Gapminder. I don't know how many of you have seen it. So I'm going to show you a little simulation. So what we have here in this chart is in the horizontal axis, we have income per capita. This is GDP per capita, okay, and it has been adjusted for inflation. So we go from $10,000, $20,000 up to $90,000, okay, per year. And then in the vertical axis, we have energy used per person. And these units are equivalent ton of oil. These are some normalizing units. And this is a snapshot of 1960. Each one of these circles corresponds to a different country. So, for example, here is the US. If we want to see where Spain is, let's see, where is Spain? So here is Spain in 1960. The income per person in 1960 in Spain was $4,600. Energy per person was 0.53 in these units, okay? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to run this simulation. So you're going to see here how time evolves. Again, this is 1960, and we're going to let time move it, and we'll see what happens. So there it goes. 1960, 70, 80, 90, 2000, okay? And we have data up to 2007. So if we zoom in, okay, let's zoom in here. So let's look at some data points here. So here's the US. So the US has GDP per person of more than $40,000, 7.8 in this energy used per person, okay? Let's look at these outliers. Luxembourg, look at that, $76,000 GDP per person. I mean, this is just astronomical. Everybody's wealthy in Luxembourg. Look at that, Qatar, okay? $76,000. What's interesting here is look at the energy utilization of Qatar, okay? It's almost 20 in this scale. Iceland, okay? 37,016 in the energy units. UAE, okay? Let's see, where is Spain? Here's Spain. So Spain is $28,000 in 2007, 3.2 in these units, okay? Look at this big red circle. There's China, okay? So the diameter of these circles corresponds to population, okay? So the US has about 310 million people in 2007. They're about 335 now, the population of the US. China here has a population of about 1.4 billion. They are close to 1.6 today, okay? Look at the blue disc underneath. There's India, okay? And then you can look at, where is Brazil? Let's look for Brazil. There is Brazil, okay? The largest economy in South America, and so forth. So this is Russia, South Korea, okay? United Kingdom. So as good engineers, okay, you are engineers, you can see that there is a very strong correlation between GDP and energy utilization, okay? The more money you make, you can afford a second car, you're gonna buy air conditioning in your house, You're going to buy another plasma TV. You're going to have a microwave oven. You're probably going to have 2 computers. If you live near a lake or a river, you're going to have a boat. And all these things utilize energy. So the more money you make, the more energy you are going to use. And this is a very, very strong correlation. In fact, let's go back here. It's a very strong correlation. So if you plot, again, GDP per capita versus energy utilization, in this case, we have gigajoules per capita, you can see there is a very strong correlation. In fact, this slope, it's remarkable that this slope is the same for most of these countries, okay? And the reason why is that the Western way of living has really permeated with everybody. Everybody wants to live like people live in the US, okay? This is the influence of the US and the Western world I mean, even countries like Malaysia, Thailand, everybody's climbing. This is the so-called energy ladder, okay? Everybody wants to climb this energy. What's interesting here is that, look at the US. So the US, it's in a class by itself. Obviously, we saw Qatar, Luxembourg, but these are small countries. The US has 330 million people. And what happened here in the US is that once you reach around $20,000, this value is almost flat. Okay, and what happens is that once you have everything that you need, that's it. You know, I mean, you'll spend money in clothing or something else, but pretty much it gets a plateau once you get to $20,000. The difference here with the European Union and Japan is that in Europe and in Japan, they have very stringent energy efficiency policies. I mean, even just look at the price of oil and gasoline. I mean, here in Europe, you pay almost $1 for a liter of gasoline. In the US, we were paying almost $1 for a gallon of gasoline. I mean, there's almost a factor of 4 in cost of energy. So in the US, we really waste a lot of energy. And this is why we are up here by ourselves. So this is the reason why even in the European Union and Japan, you reach a plateau. Once you get to $15,000 per capita, you reach a plateau. This is why these things are right. But there are some exceptions. You know, Australia keeps on climbing here. We don't know if there's going to be a plateau there. The problem with Australia is lack of water. I don't know if you've been following, but they have major droughts in the last few years in Australia. So to purify water, they have to use a lot of energy. And this gets reflected in this type of chart. But I want to bring your attention to China and India. And the question that economists ask all the time is, what's going to happen when every Chinese starts living like an American? What's going to happen when every Indian starts living with an American? Everybody's going to be driving a car. They want to have air conditioning. They want to travel. They want to have plasma TVs, microwave ovens. And what's going to be the impact of having countries like China, Brazil, India climbing the energy ladder? You know, what's going to happen with that? And by the way, I show you the data for Spain. As of 2014, the GDP per capita was $30,000. This is in 2014 dollars. This is $1997. So that just puts in perspective where Spain is in the rest of the world. So this is the big question. How are we going to use energy in the future? So in this chart, what we have here is a scale of energy per year. This is total energy in the planet. The units are exajoules, 1 times 10 to the 18 joules. It's an astronomical amount of energy. And here we have time from the year 2000 to the middle of the century, 2050. And we have data for every 10 years. The colors correspond to different regions. So Asia and Oceania in the developing part are these big bars, okay? So here is India, here is China, okay? Europe, it's right here in blue. In fact, if you look at energy utilization in Europe, it's expected to decrease. And this is a result of the shrinkage in population in Europe in the next 50 years. You can see this, how it's going to start going down. Look at the North America. This is Mexico, the US, and Canada. In fact, it's expected to increase because the population in the US is expected to increase. This is Asia and Oceania. This is the part of the developed world. This is Japan, Korea, and Australia. Okay. But this is what should catch your attention. Look how much energy is going to be needed to support the economies of China and India in particular, okay? That is a big challenge. And these, again, are actual units of exajoules per year, 1 times 10 to the 18 joules per year. So this is the same data plotted in a different way. What we have here is time from the beginning of the century to the end of the century. And here is world energy use in exajoules. The previous chart went only to 2050, so was expecting to see energy here close to 600 exajoules, okay? So that's the same data set. This is 2050, so that's where we are here, okay? But this chart goes all the way to the end of the century. So the question is, if we don't do anything, okay, if we just continue living the way we've been living for the last 50 years, this is where energy is going to come from to satisfy the need for growth in the rest of the planet, okay? And the majority of the energy sources are going to be fossil fuels. You're going to have natural gas, you're going to have petroleum, and then you're going to have a lot of coal, okay? In fact, the majority of the energy needs in the planet are going to come from fossil fuels. And this is assuming that we don't do anything. We just continue doing what we are doing. Coal is cheap. You know, we'll just continue using coal. Oil, we continue developing technologies to get oil from farther down in the bottom of the ocean. I talk about hydraulic fracturing. You know, we have developed technologies to get natural gas at a relatively low cost. So this, if nothing happens, is going to supply all the energy needs of the planet for the next 85 years. And then you can see here nuclear. It's expected that nuclear will continue growing. We'll talk about the 4th generation of nuclear power plants here in a minute. And then look at renewables. You know, renewables will provide just a very small fraction of the energy needs in the future, okay? And this is if we don't do anything. This is what we call business as usual. You probably have heard that expression, business as usual. We don't do anything, pay the least amount of money that we can for energy, and that's where the energy is going to come from. And we should really be worried about it because all of these fossil fuel power plants generate a lot of carbon emissions, okay? And I'm preaching here to the choir because we've been talking about this for the last 25 years, okay? But it's important that we review it. Every way we produce electricity, whether it's by using coal to produce steam, has a lot of carbon emissions. Whether we improve efficiency by using these combined cycles, we still generate a lot of carbon, not as much as by burning coal, but nonetheless, there's still a lot of carbon. These are carbon emissions normalized by kilowatt hour of energy. These are some advanced cycles. They are more efficient, but nonetheless, we generate a lot of carbon. Even natural gas, you know, there is this misunderstanding that natural gas is clean. Well, everything is relative, you know. It's cleaner than coal, but still, if you burn natural gas, you produce CO2. And here are the equivalent emissions for natural gas. So better than coal, but still a lot of CO2 emissions. And then you have nuclear technologies, whether it's fission or fusion, which are much cleaner. And then obviously the renewables are the desirable. So we know this, you know, we have known this for many years. This is a way for us to reduce the carbon intensity in the system by utilizing nuclear and renewable sources of energy. So let's, you know, as an American, let me share with you, you know, there's an organization in the US called Alcohólicos Anónimos. Have you heard about it? Okay. And the first thing you gotta do is you say, hi, my name is Joe, and I'm an alcoholic, okay? So this is the equivalent, okay? This is the equivalent statement here. The realization that, you know, that the US economy has grown, we are the leading economy in the world, but the reality is that we have been able to do that because we use plentiful and cheap energy. This is mainly coal and natural and fossil fuels. And that's a reality. I mean, we are not going to deny it. We are also not going to deny that even though we have 5% of the population, we utilize 25% of the energy in the planet. You know, it's actually embarrassing. And there are people in the US who say, hey, so what? You know, so what? And we'll talk about here in a minute about public policies. So this is a realization that there is a problem. And also, you know, we U.S., we have a responsibility. We really have a responsibility with the rest of the planet. And our responsibility is to lead. We really have to lead. And I'll talk about politics here in a minute. But that's a real responsibility that we have in the U.S. Now, there's an old saying, and it says Americans can always be counted on to do the right thing after they have exhausted all other possibilities. Okay, that was Winston Churchill, and that's actually the case here. I mean, we know what needs to be done, and we are playing dumb, and hopefully we'll come around here in the near future. So what can we do? Well, we can do a lot of things, and there are hundreds and hundreds of studies on what can be done. This is a good example. This is Sokolow and Pakala. They develop a very influential study that provides a template for what the U.S. and the rest of the world could do to reduce the intensity of carbon. So things that you can do is, number one, improve energy efficiency, okay? And we'll talk about that on Thursday. We'll talk about energy efficiency on Thursday. And if you implement energy efficiency standards, you can reduce significantly the amount of carbon emissions that go into the atmosphere, okay? So if you don't do anything, you will continue increasing carbon emissions as a function of time. If you improve energy efficiency, you're going to reduce this amount of carbon from the atmosphere. And we'll talk about the type of technologies that need to be implemented. You can improve the efficiency of automobiles, and this is the equivalent amount of carbon that you will remove from the atmosphere. So what does that mean? Well, you can electrify transportation. You can improve the mileage efficiency of cars from 30 miles a gallon to 50 miles a gallon, or why not 100 miles a gallon? We can do that. And if you were to implement those policies, you will remove a lot of carbon from the atmosphere. You could do the same with trucks and railroad, and you will remove more carbon from the atmosphere. Implementing renewables, solar, wind, hydro, geothermal. And then the other thing is that we are not going to remove coal right away. We're going to continue burning coal and fossil fuels for the next 50 years. But at least one thing that we can do is at least capture carbon in the form of CO2 and store it for a long time. And by doing that, we will remove carbon from the atmosphere. So this is a recipe. There are lots of things that can be done, and we'll talk about those things today and this week. But that's something that the U.S. can do. That's something that the U.S. can do. But the U.S. is just one small component of the planet. And the real issue here is the developing economies. China, India, Brazil, the third world. That's really where the challenge is. And I don't know how many of you have visited China. China is actually facing some very serious challenges when it comes to environmental pollution. These are just some examples of the situation. So we got to give credit to the Chinese because at least they have started implementing some policies, including agreements with the U.S. This is very recent, where the U.S. and China have agreed at least to put some caps on CO2 emissions on the planet. So this is good news. Here is when we talk about leadership from the U.S. This is what I'm talking about, being able to approach the rest of the world, and work together. Because the U.S. is not the only player here. The developing economies are really the ones who are going to drive the greatest change here in the future. The other thing that's going to happen is that in Paris there are some climate talks coming up here fairly soon, in June, and again the U.S. is going to be present. And hopefully it will continue pushing other countries to join and participate in these global efforts. Okay, let me skip this one. So we talk about policy. So I just show you an example of President Obama reaching out to the Chinese, leading the delegation in the Paris talks. But the reality is that politics plays a major role. We were talking about the factors that will control energy utilization in the future. So we talk about economic development, we talk about climate change, global changes in weather patterns, we talk about economic development, we talk about public policies. And this is an example of some of the frustration that we feel in the US. So these are headlines from the New York Times. This is from 1973. And you are too young to remember this, but there was an oil embargo back in the 1970s, okay? There was an Arab-Israeli war in the Middle East, and as a result of that, Saudi Arabia, in particular, Kuwait and other countries, started limiting exports of oil to the US. And what happened is that the price of oil went through the roof. $14 a barrel of oil. I mean, today we are paying almost 50, but at the time 14 was a lot. And that really brought the economies of the West to their knees. Okay, this was a major challenge. And when that happened, there was a president in the US, his name was Gerald Ford. And Gerald Ford gave a State of the Union address. Every year in January, the president goes to the Congress, and they give the State of the Union address. And if you read, this is actually very interesting, because if you read this document, it says, we have to reduce oil imports by 1 million barrels per day. So, this is something that every politician has been talking about since the 1970s, in the US. We got to reduce how much oil we import from the world. We got to use coal. This is very interesting. We got to use coal because there's a lot of coal in the US, but we know what the impact is. We have to redevelop our nuclear power program. This is before 3 Mile Island. There was a big accident in the US where a nuclear power plant almost had a meltdown. This is before that. And since the accident in 3 Mile Island, we have not built another nuclear power plant in the US. Even though in 1973, there was still aspirations for developing a strong nuclear program in the United States. They talk about efficiency standards. If you're going to buy an appliance, it has to meet certain standards. If you're going to buy a refrigerator, it has to meet certain standards. If you're going to buy a car, it has to have certain standards. So this document is actually very, very instructive. The problem is that, a year later, the embargo was lifted, price of oil went down, and we just forgot about the crisis. Okay. Then 2008, we had another crisis. I show you that chart that shows the price of energy and the recessions. And then all of a sudden, you could put word by word, George Bush was president of the US in 2008. And if you put the speech of Gerald Ford in 73, and you listen to the speech of George Bush in 2008, they are almost identical. We got to reduce our dependence on foreign oil. We have to improve energy efficiency. We have to utilize coal. At least they talk about the environment now in 2008. We have to strengthen our nuclear fleet. So that's politics, and that's a reality that we have to live with. In 2005, that's the last time the Congress passed a policy for energy in the US. That's a relatively old document, and the Congress finally has started reworking on this energy policy in the US. And something that has happened here with President Obama is the realization that we have to do more in the US, okay? And at least one of the goals that is going to be by 2025 is that every automobile has to meet at least the standard of almost 55 miles per gallon. And it was just about time. We have wasted so much energy in the US, but at least this is happening, and this is written in the law. So every company that makes cars in the US has to meet this fuel standard. So finally, things are happening here. I don't know how many of you follow politics in the US, but the sad part about this, and this is something that is really frustrating. There is a region of the US, especially in the region of Kentucky, Pennsylvania, West Virginia. They have the largest deposits of coal almost in the world. There is coal for the next 300 years, okay? And there is an expression in the US, a tree hugger is an environmentalist. If you believe in the environment, they call you a tree hugger, okay? And that's almost like a pejorative. It's almost like an insult. So this is a demonstration in West Virginia where 80% of the economy in West Virginia is coal. These are people who have worked in the mines, their parents work in the mines, their grandparents work in the mines. The sad part about this is that the life expectancy for these people are 40, 45 years. These people die very young. They are breathing all the crap in the mine, and they don't care. They don't care. And so this is an example of how they have protested every policy of President Obama when it comes to coal. This is the sad part. And it's actually sadder that this is the senator from Kentucky. His name is Mitch McConnell. And by the way, if you are taping this, this is my personal opinion, okay? So I don't want that anybody believes that I'm speaking for the Oak Ridge National Laboratory. So I'm just speaking here for myself. I might get in trouble by talking politics. But this is the frustration that you have somebody as powerful as McConnell. He's the leader of the Senate. Listen to that. He's asking the states to reject the president's mandate for clean power regulations, okay? And in the U.S., you know, the U.S. is a federal system where the states are very powerful. And here you have the leader of the Senate asking all the governors and all the state legislatures to reject all these initiatives that President Obama has put forward to reduce the carbon intensity in the economy. This is the sad part. And the guy is so powerful that a lot of the things that the president has been talking about, you know, putting limits on CO2 emissions, improving fuel efficiency in automobiles, are in limbo right now. In fact, there is an agency called the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, that has actually set some rules, and they are challenging those rules. You know, one of those rules is how much CO2 can you put if you're burning coal, and everything is up in legal limbo. So that's a reality in the U.S. There's a newspaper, the New York Times. It's very influential. There is a writer for the New York Times. His name is Tom Friedman. And Tom Friedman is also a very influential guy. And he wrote a column about 5 years ago. The title of the column was China for a Day. And in the column, he was making the argument that he had just visited China. And he couldn't believe how much money the federal government in China had put into infrastructure. They had brand new airports, brand new highways, brand new convention center. He said, you know, they have these levitating magnetic trains. You can go to the airport in Shanghai. They have a high-speed train to go from Beijing to Shanghai. Yeah. ¿La pila? Muy bien, muy bien. ¿Todavía no están quedando dormidos? ¿No? Yo les pido perdón porque yo doy clases, yo no doy clases para vivir. Entonces, perdón si de alguna manera, bien que el ritmo no está bien, les pido una disculpa, pero a mí me gusta venir a hablar con estudiantes, por eso le agradezco mucho a José Ignacio. ¿Ya regresó? Sí, le agradezco mucho la oportunidad de venir a hablar con ustedes. Mi trabajo es hacer investigación. No tengo estudiante ni nada, pero me da esta oportunidad de venir a hablar. Y al final de la semana yo les voy a pedir que me den feedback, sugerencias para mejorar la forma en la que se transmite la información. ¿Ok? Ok, bueno, vamos a ver. Okay, very good. So it's politics, you know. It's really politics, and that's a reality that we have to live with. So we're talking about Tom Friedman. So Tom Friedman, he writes a column for the New York Times. Very influential guy. So he goes to China, and he's attending a conference, and he goes to a brand new convention center, and he talks about this high-speed train and the new airports and the infrastructure. And he comes back to the U.S. He lives in the Northeast, and he happens to go into Washington, D.C., and he's going to take the subway, and the escalators are not working. And there's a sign that says, well, these escalators are going to be out of service for the next 15 weeks for repairs. And he's so frustrated. You know, how is it possible that the U.S., you know, the country that put a man on the moon and develop the nuclear bomb, you know, it's going to take us 15 weeks to repair the escalators. Well, you have China building new airports. They are building a power plant every 10 days. So he writes his column, and the title of the column is China for a Day. He says, you know, I wish the U.S. could be like China for a day, where you have the central government really dictating. In China they built this massive dam, the gorgeous dam, and they relocate. I don't know how many people they move people, and nobody protests. The central government in China says this is what we're going to do for the next year, and everybody salutes and they do it. In the U.S. it doesn't happen that way, okay? And actually he got a lot of criticism. I mean, people really. I understand what Friedman was trying to say, that I wish that we didn't have this bickering with the Congress, because otherwise we could be moving faster addressing some of these challenges. But I mean, the backlash was incredible. They say, well, how do you compare China, human rights, and blah, blah, blah. And I think people took it the wrong way. But the message was very clear. Sometimes we appreciate the freedom, we appreciate the system, but sometimes there is a lot of paralysis. And what we are seeing in the US is really the result of these entrenched interest groups who fight in the Congress. And again, this is very sad, but that's a reality. And the only way this is going to change is the majority of the public get rid of people like him. But when you have people in his state, these are the people who vote this guy into office, okay? And that's a reality. So, in any event, okay.